The next test we're going to look at is called the t-test. And the t-test has some different assumptions. So first of all, it has that one variable is continuous, so like income, education, test score, those kinds of things, a continuous variable. But the other variables can be dichotomous. So you could do it based on nominal, so male versus female, sort of like we were talking about before. You could look at groups of people, so high, medium, low. You could look at what happened before they were there, so like have they had exposure to this information before, had they not, was this the first time they were diagnosed, have they been in the program before. So it's really looking at two different groups, and it's looking for what's the difference between those two groups based on your independent variable. It also has to have two distributions, so equal variance. So it sort of assumes that there's equal variance between the groups, and again we sort of know that previously because we looked at what's happened within each of those groups, as we talked about in previous videos. It also has to mean that they're independent and that they're sort of normally distributed. Okay, so again, it's different types of variables. It's not just nominal variables. It's got to have one that's continuous and one that's not. And what it's really looking for is the means between those continuous variables. So it's looking for the mean between the test score or the exam score, even if it's sort of pre-test. If you're looking at between males and females, you could look at the actual score between each group. You could look at the level of knowledge they have between each group, those kinds of things. But it's looking at two independent groups. It's not looking at just one group. Okay? And one of the things that it can do is it can tell you if there's a positive or negative relationship, which is really nice, because sometimes there's a negative relationship with maybe women have lower scores, so there's a negative relationship between gender, and then we could go back to our chi-square and see what that is. Okay, so again, we're doing this to look at specifically between two groups who are independent from each other, and we're making sure that one's dichotomous and that one's continuous. Again, types of variables, which we talked about previously in other videos, and what you can or can't do with them. We're actually assuming that there's some independence. We do run a test for that, and again, you'll see that when we talk about that in the video. One of the things, though, is that for a lot of people, you're looking at a group before and after, so they're not independent. So that sort of violates one of the tenets. But one of the ways to do that is you take what's called the paired t-test. So there's different types of t-tests. There's the standard t-test, but then you look at a paired t-test. And what that's doing is it's pairing like a before and after a group, right? So a group that gets an intervention and a group that doesn't, their before exam, and then after the intervention, their exam. So a group that's, if you had a control group, you'd look for the level of education or how they did on an exam, if they had a tutor, or if they had an educational intervention, or if they had access to resources. You'd look at, here's the group of people are in a program and they have this educational component, the other group isn't. Let's compare their before and their after to see what the difference is between the two groups. So it's a really standard test, a t-test, paired t-test for that. That's the before and after. It does assume that you're looking at a control and intervention group in those cases, not sort of the same group over time. But again, the t-test is a pretty standard test that you look at. It's got some basic assumptions. They're not quite as strict. Again, they have limitations, and you will have already known if you don't have a lot of variance, if one group does vary and the other doesn't, which is why we've done those tests before. And then paired t-test is a really great one for looking at control and intervention groups to see a before and after, or often to look at one group before they had their intervention and then after. Okay, so, but it's usually not looking at tons and tons of variables. It's looking at 4 or 5 variables. So whether they had the intervention or not looking at necessarily all the other control variables, that's another type of test. But it is a pretty standard test. You try it first. Again, you have to have the rules. You have to follow the rules. And this it has the assumptions that the variable has to have one that's continuous and the other ones can be dichotomous, so they can be independent or dependent. It also has to have distribution of equal variance, so you already know if that exists or not. And it also, you want to look for samples that are independent, unless you're doing the paired t-test, where you're looking at sort of a control and intervention. One got the intervention and one didn't, and you're looking at their test scores before and after the intervention. Okay, so they're sort of independent from each other, but they're not independent in the sense of you're looking at one group before and after for both groups. That would be a paired t-test that has different assumptions. Okay, again, pretty standard test, but it does depend on following those rules.